June 2026, Coatepec, Veracruz. A backhoe idles beside a housing project called Bosque San Lucas. Archaeologist Lino Espinoza Garcia's crew has days before construction resumes. A trowel meets stone, a slab nearly 2 meters tall, buried beneath a platform unlike anything on record here. No one had seen a face carved quite like it. So whose face was this, carved into stone and left buried where nobody was meant to find it? And why do the Popoluca families of these hills say the ground here was never truly empty? This was not a routine salvage dig, it was the newest thread in a mystery 3,000 years old, and no one has ever been able to close it. What follows weighs carved stone against buried cities, and a contested decipherment against living memory, to ask who first told this story, and who has quietly kept telling it ever since. For nearly a century, Mexican archaeology treated the Gulf Coast's deep past as reasonably settled. Scholars in the 1940s named the Olmec Cultura Madre, the mother culture, arguing that Mesoamerica's later writing, religion and kingship all trace back to farming villages that rose beside the Coatzacoalcos River around 1600 BCE. That is the version taught in classrooms and printed on museum plaques. But when researchers finally excavated San Lorenzo, the earliest known Olmec center, they expected to find a civilization still becoming one. Small shrines growing into larger ones, modest households slowly swelling into a court. They found almost none of that. By around 1400 BCE, San Lorenzo appears already organized, already carving basalt boulders hauled more than 90 kilometers from the Tuxtla Mountains, already commissioning stone portraits of rulers nearly 3 meters tall. There is no infancy on record. A civilization capable of moving 20-ton stone through swamp and river simply appears, fully formed, and that absence has never been resolved. The second problem is quieter and far less finished. In 1986, fishermen dredged a limestone stela from the Aquila River near La Mojara, wrapped in 465 glyphs nobody could read, a script called Isthmian, or Epi-Olmec. In 1993, linguists John Justison and Terence Kaufman proposed a partial decipherment, arguing the language was Zocian, still spoken today in the hills above the Coatzacoalcos. Other epigraphers disputed the reading within a decade, and the debate was never settled. What nobody expected was for that exact visual signature to resurface under a bulldozer's blade in 2026. The carving at Coatepec carries the same Isthmian hallmarks archaeologists had only ever traced along the isthmus of Tehuantepec, centered on the very Zocian-speaking communities who still live in these hills today. So what had Espinoza Garcia's crew actually pulled out of the ground? Laboratory analysis placed the platform in the early Classic period, centuries after the Olmec heartland's so-called Golden Age was supposed to have ended. But the carving style pointed backward, not forward, toward the same stone tradition first proven real in 1862, when workers clearing a cornfield near Huiyapan struck the first colossal Olmec head ever documented, carved from 8 tons of basalt. That single find forced scholars to admit the Gulf Coast held something older and more organized than anyone had catalogued. The Coatepec stela was not an isolated oddity. It belonged to a lineage already running for over 2,000 years, one that had been quietly proving itself far larger than any single discovery could show. But how far did that lineage actually reach? In 2021, a lidar survey across 84,500 square kilometers of Tabasco and Veracruz located 478 ceremonial complexes, including a plaza inside San Lorenzo itself, invisible to 80 years of ground survey. That plaza alone measured nearly 1,000 meters long, ringed by 20 raised platforms that had sat unnoticed through every prior excavation season. The same design repeated for 2,000 years, all the way to a Maya complex 400 kilometers away. On the ground, decades of excavation had already turned up buried drainage systems and an elite residence 3 times the size of any comparable building known from that period. This was never a scattering of isolated monuments. It was infrastructure, planned, repeated, and maintained across a region the size of a small country. Then why did a script nobody can fully read keep surfacing in exactly this territory? The Isthmian glyphs wrapped around the La Mojara stela, the same visual family already linked to the fresh carving at Coatepec, were partially deciphered in 1993 as a Zoquian language, the family still spoken today by the Popoluca and Zoque communities of the Tuxtla foothills, the same hills the basalt heads were dragged down from. That reading remains genuinely disputed. But it means the Coatepec stela, the San Lorenzo Plaza, and the buried script of La Mojara were never three separate mysteries. They were three exposures of the same story, and the people best positioned to explain it never stopped living beside it. Named documentation for this story does not start with theory. It starts with paperwork, surveys, permits, and site reports filed by people whose job was to confirm or dismiss what field workers found. The Coatepec find itself was documented first by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH, which authorized the salvage project ahead of the Bosque San Lucas development in late 2025. Archaeologist Anik Danails, who has spent decades studying central Veracruz, described the carving as an unusual composition, two seated figures facing one another, with no precedent recorded anywhere else in the region. Mexico's Secretary of Culture, Claudia Curiel de Icaza, and President Claudia Sheinbaum both publicly acknowledged the find within days, an unusually fast government response for a routine salvage report, and itself a signal of how seriously officials were taking the stylistic anomaly Daniels had flagged. That anomaly only makes sense against the earlier paper trail. Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano's 1869 account of the Hoyapan head was largely dismissed for over half a century. It took Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge's 1925 expedition, sponsored by Tulane University, to formally record the same monument for an academic audience. Real scientific excavation came later still. Between 1938 and 1939, Smithsonian archaeologist Matthew Sterling, backed by the National Geographic Society, led the first systematic dig at Tres Zapotes, and his subsequent work at La Venta and San Lorenzo through the 1940s established the Olmec as a distinct, datable civilization rather than a folk curiosity. Melgar's farmhouse discovery had waited 76 years for a scientist willing to take it seriously. Coatepec stela waited considerably less, proof, some researchers say, that institutions have grown faster to listen, even if the underlying questions remain just as open. Verifying the scale of San Lorenzo took longer and required two entirely different kinds of fieldwork arriving decades apart. Archaeologist Anne Cyphers began excavating San Lorenzo in the 1990s, and her published reports through the 2000s documented the basalt drainage conduits, U-shaped stones fitted end-to-end, and the hematite-stained floor of the Red Palace in careful, unglamorous detail, the kind of infrastructure survey that rarely makes headlines but underpins everything built on top of it. It was Cyphers herself who, in 1994, uncovered the 17th and most recently found colossal head nearly 6 decades after Sterling's original excavations. Her reports also documented something stranger. Sometime between roughly 900 and 300 BCE, monuments across San Lorenzo were deliberately mutilated, noses gouged, mouths ground flat, entire heads pried loose and buried in trenches. Archaeologist Sarah Koenig, writing in 2020, compared the pattern to a form of ancient statue removal. Monuments dismantled the way societies periodically reject the politics beneath them. Other researchers argue it reads closer to a funerary rite, a ruler's spiritual authority ritually neutralized so it could never be turned against the living again. Neither theory has displaced the other, and there is no written confession to check either claim against. Then, in October of 2021, Takeshi Inomata's team published their lidar survey in the journal Nature Human Behavior, confirming a scale of organization the ground surveys alone had never fully captured: 478 ceremonial centers, a repeated architectural blueprint, and a previously undocumented plaza at San Lorenzo itself, sitting in plain sight through 80 years of fieldwork before an aircraft finally traced its outline from above. The third verification is the one researchers argue about most, because it reaches furthest and proves the least conclusively. Linguists John Justison and Terence Kaufman published their Isthmian decipherment in the journal Science in 1993, followed by a second paper in 1997. arguing that the 465 glyphs wrapped around the La Mojara stela recorded a Zotkian language, the same family spoken today by Popoluca and Zot communities of the Tuxtla foothills. Their work earned a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2003. The following year, epigraphers Stephen Houston and Michael Coe published a direct challenge, arguing the proposed reading system failed to transfer cleanly onto a separate Isthmian inscription found on an unrelated artifact. Neither side has conceded the point. The language behind the Coatepec stela's visual family, strictly speaking, remains unread. What is harder to dismiss is a much smaller, much older piece of testimony. In 1968, archaeologist Alfonso Medellin Zenil of the Universidad Veracruzana studied a monumental basalt figure recovered from the summit of the San Martin Pajapan volcano, a peak sacred to the Popoluca and Nahua communities who live along its slopes. In his published account, Medellin Zenil noted that the Popoluca and Nahua residents nearest the mountain had always known of the stone figure at its peak, long before any archaeologist climbed up to document it. There was no expedition that discovered that monument in any conventional sense. There was only a research team finally arriving to confirm what families living on the volcano's lower slopes had never stopped saying. Whether that same continuity reaches all the way back to the unread glyphs at La Mojara is something linguists are still fighting over. But the pattern of local knowledge preceding formal discovery is no longer an isolated anecdote. By the time Espinoza Garcia's crew reached Coatepec in 2026, it had already happened at least twice before, in the same corner of Mexico, separated by more than 3,000 years. Long before Medellin Zenil climbed San Martin Pachapan with survey equipment, the Popoluca families living on its slopes already had a name for what governed that mountain, and for why certain places on it were never treated as empty ground. In the Popoluca and Nahua cosmology of the Tuxtla foothills, the volcanic sierra that includes San Martin Pachapan and the neighboring peak of Santa Marta is understood to conceal an underworld called Talogan, governed by a figure named Chain, lord of the mountain and its animals. Chan commands a class of spirits, the Shan X, said to guard springs, waterfalls, caves, and specifically the sites where the ancestors once lived. These ancestral sites are described as entrances into Talogan itself, thresholds between the world of the living and a realm of abundance below the ground. Researchers who have recorded this tradition, including anthropologist Antonio Garcia de Leon in his study of the supernatural beliefs held in Pachapan, note that Chan's physical presence on the mountain was long tied to the very monument Medellin Zenil would later study and remove. Informants told researchers that taking the figure off the summit was itself an act with consequences, a disturbance of something still active, not simply the relocation of an old carving. This tradition is not a folk footnote appended after the fact. It is a working framework that predates the archaeological attention paid to these sites by generations, and it assigns those sites a continuous, still living significance that a laboratory date range cannot fully capture on its own. Where named documentation asks when a stone was carved and by whom, the Popoluca framework asks what a place still is and who still holds responsibility for it. Neither question cancels the other out. A radiocarbon date and a Chanex's watch over a cave are not competing explanations for the same fact. They are two different kinds of knowledge answering two different kinds of question, and this story treats both as legitimate. Popoluca elders in Sotopan and Pajapan continue to hold that the Tuxtla Sierra as a whole functions this way, not only at San Martin Pajapan. Every cave, spring, and old settlement mound across the range is treated as a potential threshold, watched over rather than simply mapped. That framework offers one more way of reading the destruction pattern found at San Lorenzo, the gouged noses, the buried heads, not necessarily as erasure in the modern political sense researchers like Sarah Koenig have proposed, but as an act consistent with a worldview in which certain monuments needed to be closed deliberately and carefully, rather than simply abandoned. That particular reading remains speculative, and no Popoluca account directly addresses the San Lorenzo mutilations by name. It is offered here as one more lens available to the story, not a decisive one, exactly the kind of open interpretation this landscape keeps generating, no matter which discipline approaches it. It is worth being honest about the limits of what can actually be verified here. There is no way to test in any laboratory sense whether the guardianship attributed to Chan and the Charnics is the same belief the Isthmian writing communities held 3,000 years ago, or a tradition that has changed shape many times across that span, the way every living tradition does. What can be documented is narrower and more remarkable. These communities were never absent from the record. Their knowledge of specific sites preceded formal excavation more than once, and the disciplines built to study this ground have each independently arrived at conclusions they did not need a laboratory to reach first. There is a particular kind of humility this landscape keeps demanding of the people who study it. Every method arrives with its own vocabulary and its own blind spots. Radiocarbon dating cannot hear a story passed down at a hearth, and a hearth story cannot fix a date to within a century. Lidar can outline a plaza no one walked over in 80 years of fieldwork, but it cannot say what the people who built it called themselves, or why, centuries later, their descendants chose to bury their own monuments rather than let them keep standing. A script can be partially read and still refuse to say with certainty whose ancestors it belongs to. What accumulates, discovery after discovery, is not a finished picture but a widening one. The Gulf Coast has now given up its first colossal head, its buried aqueducts, its unread glyphs, its city-wide plazas invisible from the ground, and its living communities who never stopped naming these places as their own, and every one of those threads still ends in an open question rather than a closed file. That may be less satisfying than a single confirmed answer. It is also, historians increasingly argue, the more honest shape of the truth, a history assembled from fragments that were never meant to be read in isolation, buried on purpose by some hands, and watched over, without interruption, by others. What the Tuxtla foothills keep proving, discovery after discovery, is that no single method, not a trowel, not a laser, not a translated glyph, ever gets to close the file alone. Thank you for spending this time with us in the Tuxtla foothills, weighing carved basalt against buried plazas, and a contested decipherment against living testimony that never needed a laboratory to confirm it. If documentaries that take oral tradition as seriously as they take radiocarbon dates matter to you, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more of this coastline still waiting to be reopened, one salvage permit at a time. Here is the question we will leave you with, the same one Lino Espinoza Garcia's team now carries back to the lab in Salapa. If a community has always known where to look, at what point does an archaeological discovery actually begin? With the first shovel that breaks the surface, or with the first person who simply never forgot what was underneath it? I'll see you in the next documentary.